We might see another Muslim drinking, for example. Nobody would be going to heaven.
None of us are going to enter Jannah because of our good deeds. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. What is a good Muslim? The other day I was talking to a professor and we were talking about some of the sociological benefits of Islam. Some of the benefits within the community and within society that are brought about by some of the prohibitions in Islam. And I was talking about the prohibition of consumption of alcohol, for example. And she mentioned that some Muslims, they do drink alcohol. And straight away I went into a response, which was kind of explaining that away. And it might have seemed to be a response that would have been considered appeasing to a non-Muslim society. That, yes, in Islam we're quite strict about these things, but, and you kind of explain yourself. But that paradigm of explaining faults away from other people and putting blame on the action and condemning the action and not the person, not excommunicating the people, and not labeling someone as a bad Muslim because they commit a sin, that itself is actually an Islamic paradigm. There's a hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ, he said that a man said that by Allah, Allah will not forgive this person. Allah the Almighty said that who is he who swore by me that I will not forgive someone? I have forgiven him and nullified your deeds.
I think it's really interesting that we're not denying that certain actions are sins. But the important thing here to note is no human being has the right to ultimate judgment over another human being. No human being gets to decide whether another human being, Muslim or non-Muslim, is a good person or that they know whether that person is going to go to heaven or to hell. In Islam, it's about what we call taqwa or God consciousness. It's about your connection with God. And although, sure, certain actions reflect what's inside you, and that's also important to note, but ultimately only God knows how much you're connected with Him. I can't judge how connected you are to God or how good a person you are, how good a Muslim you are. And I just don't know that. Also, we lack a lot of empathy in this day and age where we're quick to judge other people. So we might see another Muslim drinking, for example, but we have no idea about where they come from, what their childhood was like, what they experienced, what kind of trauma they may have experienced. And this goes, I've noticed, for a lot of famous people who've become Muslim, that kind of the general Muslim population is very quick to judge those people, especially converts. And they don't realize that these people may have gone through a lot of trauma in their lives, perhaps addictions, and those things are not easy to erase. You can't just get rid of them overnight. And this is where we lack a lot of empathy, and I see a lot of this sort of activity online where people are commenting saying you're not Muslim, you're not a good person, you're not a good Muslim because I see you drinking or I see you smoking or I see you doing certain actions. Or even when these people, like certain converts for example, they're seen praying, Muslims, they criticize the prayer, which is absolutely ridiculous. How is that person meant to know how to pray if they've never prayed their whole life and they're recently converted? And that's just, on a very basic level, it's not very encouraging, is it? Especially when you leave everything you know for your whole life. In a lot of these cases with converts, you leave a full culture. Some of these converts have to leave their parents essentially. And people who are born Muslim are already involved in the culture. They don't realize that. They have no empathy for that, how difficult that is, and how difficult it is to adapt to a completely new sort of environment, belief system, culture. We really lack a lot of empathy, and that puts off a lot of people from Islam. And that shouldn't be the case, not because it's putting people off from Islam, but because it's un-Islamic to do so.
We learn from another very famous hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. He said, none of us are going to enter Jannah because of our good deeds, but through the mercy of God. It is through the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that will allow us to enter Jannah. Because all the deeds that we do, we can never do them perfectly. Even if we do them, they will never reach the level that we worship God the way that He deserves to be worshipped. And we can never fulfill that. The other point that's very important that a lot of Muslims, a lot of practicing Muslims, tend to forget completely. Doing a particular sin is sinful. And doing it out of a habit and being addicted to a particular sin is an issue. But it is so much better for a person who is struggling with a sin, and he knows that this is a sin. He knows that this is not acceptable. He knows that this isn't acceptable in Islam, and he's trying, or he or she is trying to change that. That's much better than a person who doesn't have the same issue. He's not inclined to that particular sin, and he's sitting back and he's passing a judgment that this fella, he is beyond forgiveness. That is an extremely major issue, to condemn someone in such a way.
I was reading the other day that if people were to decide who goes to heaven and hell, nobody would be going to heaven.
Yeah.
Everybody would be going to hell. Because obviously we see imperfections, we focus on those imperfections, or we see people performing certain sins, and we think, oh, this person is probably a terrible person, or he isn't perfect according to my criteria. And nobody would be going to heaven.
As Muslims, we need to be clear that how we get to heaven is by fulfilling the obligations and staying away from the prohibitions as much as possible, and doing as much as you can of the things that are optional, all the rituals that you can do and all the other acts of worship that are actually beyond rituals, that we do that as much as we can, and that is the way to get to heaven. Right? But everyone's journey is going to be slightly different. Everyone will have different challenges and the way that they deal with those challenges, and they will be compensated for accordingly. So the example that you were giving was of two different people. One person who is naturally inclined to do a sin, and he has the means readily available to him to perform that sin. Another person isn't naturally inclined to do that same sin, and he doesn't have those means readily available. For the second person to go out of his way to commit that sin is a much different situation than if the first person commits that sin. So it's two different situations, and they will be compensated in different ways. It's not to belittle the sin, but it's to put perspective and to allow us as those who are not judges to allow us to have some empathy for other people.
Rather than mindlessly criticizing that person or trying to humiliate them, you should probably approach them and ask them how you can help, because you probably can. And that kind of support is, well, it's really lacking in this day and age, because people are quick to judge, they're quick to point the finger. That could be due to your own insecurities or a variety of reasons. But if you actually go out of your way to try to help that person, that could be a means of you entering heaven as well.
And we'll just finish on a verse of the Quran in which Allah is addressing the Prophet himself. And he says, لَيْسَ لَكَ مِنَ الْأَمْرِ شَيْءٍ, that you have no say in this matter of deciding who goes to heaven, who goes to hell. That the matter of judgment belongs to Allah. And in the same way, the burden of judgment isn't upon us, that we decide who goes to heaven and who goes to hell. Like you said, that if we were to decide who goes to heaven, then no one would go to heaven. So what our duty is, as people who want to become good Muslims, that we show the message of Islam in a way that people can relate to it, in a way that people can actually feel that there is something in Islam for them. The Prophet constantly gave advice, make things easy for people, don't make things difficult. That doesn't mean that don't say there are no obligations in Islam, that nothing is prohibited in Islam, but rather present it in a way that people can understand that it's not easy. Fair enough, there's going to be difficulties, there's going to be some effort you have to put into it, but this is necessary. This is something that is important, and you have to bring that across in a way that people can relate to that. So, what is a good Muslim? As Muslims, consider the obligations as obligations, recognize the prohibitions as prohibitions, But be mindful of the fact that you and others as human beings will fulfill those obligations and stay away from those prohibitions in a way that is imperfect. And with that, we'll see you in the next video.